I've been driving trucks for over 20 years, and I've seen my share of strange things on the road, but what happened last week has me considering hanging up my keys for good. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I need to get this off my chest. I was hauling a load from Denver to Salt Lake City, a route I know like the back of my hand. The drive through the Rockies can be beautiful, but also treacherous at night. It was around 2 a.m., and I was making good time, even though the fog was thicker than usual. Visibility was low, but I'd driven through worse. About halfway through my journey, I noticed a figure standing by the side of the road. Not unusual, hitchhikers, stranded motorists, you see them all the time. But this guy was different. He was tall, with long, unkempt hair and a dirty trench coat. What struck me was how still he was. Most people would wave or try to flag you down, but he just stood there staring straight ahead. As I drove past, I felt a chill run down my spine. I glanced in my rearview mirror and he was gone, vanished into the fog. I brushed it off as my eyes playing tricks on me. Lack of sleep can do that. A few miles down the road, I saw him again. Same spot, same stance. It was impossible. I hadn't stopped or turned around. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. This time I didn't look back. I pressed down on the accelerator, eager to put some distance between us. But he kept appearing. Every few miles, there he was. Each time, closer to the edge of the road, closer to my truck. I couldn't understand it. My rational mind told me it had to be a coincidence, maybe some homeless guy following the road. But deep down, I knew something was very wrong. Then, about an hour outside Salt Lake City, I saw him standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my truck skidding to a halt just a few feet from him. He didn't move, didn't flinch. Just stood there, staring at me with hollow black eyes. I leaned on the horn, shouting for him to move, but he didn't react. I couldn't just sit there. I had to do something. So I got out of the truck, a wrench in hand for protection. As soon as I stepped onto the pavement, the fog seemed to swallow me. I could barely see my hand in front of my face. I walked toward where he should have been, but there was nothing. No sign of him. I was about to turn back when I heard a whisper right behind me. I'm not sure what it said, but it sounded mere feet away. I spun around, but no one was there. Heart pounding, I rushed back to my truck and locked the doors. I drove the rest of the way to Salt Lake City without stopping, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. When I finally reached my destination, I was a wreck. I told the receiver about what happened, hoping for some logical explanation, but he just looked at me like I was crazy. Maybe I am. I haven't been back on that route since. I'm not sure I ever will be. All I know is something was out there that night. Something that wanted me to see it. And if you're ever driving through the Rockies in the dead of night, keep your eyes on the road and don't stop for anything. You never know what might be waiting in the fog. I'm a long-haul trucker, been doing this job for nearly 15 years. Most of the time it's routine, drive, deliver, sleep, repeat. But every once in a while something happens that's worth a good story time. This is one of those times. This happened just last month. I was on a run from Seattle to San Francisco. It was a standard haul, nothing unusual. I'd made the trip countless times before. The night was clear, the road was empty, and I was making good time. Somewhere near the Oregon-California border, I decided to pull over at a rest area for a quick break. I needed to stretch my legs and grab a coffee from my thermos. The rest area was deserted, which wasn't surprising given the late hour. The only light came from a flickering street lamp and the pale moon above. As I was leaning against my truck, sipping my coffee, I noticed something moving in the shadows near the restrooms. At first I thought it was an animal, a raccoon or maybe a stray dog, but then I realized it was a person, a woman to be precise. She was dressed in a tattered dress, her hair hanging in messy strands around her face. She looked like she'd been through hell. I called out to her, asking if she needed help. She didn't respond. Instead, she started walking towards me, slowly, deliberately. As she got closer, I felt a growing sense of unease. There was something off about her, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, and she had this vacant, almost haunted expression. When she was about 10 feet away, she stopped. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can you help me? I've been lost for so long." I asked her what had happened, if she needed me to call someone. She just shook her head and pointed towards the woods behind the rest area. "It's in there," she said. "I can't leave until it's gone." Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and started walking into the trees. I should have left it at that, got back in my truck and driven away. But something compelled me to follow her. Maybe it was the desperation in her voice, or maybe I just wanted to make sure she was okay. I grabbed my flashlight from the cab and followed her into the woods. The trees were dense, and the further I went, the darker it got. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional rustle of branches. I called out to her a few times, but she didn't answer. After what felt like an eternity, I came to a small clearing. The woman was standing in the middle of it, facing away from me. I approached her cautiously, my flashlight casting long shadows on the ground. When I was just a few feet away, she turned around. Her face was twisted in terror, her eyes wide with fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, something grabbed her from behind and pulled her into the darkness. I stood there, frozen in shock. I couldn't see what had taken her, but I could hear her screams echoing through the trees. I wanted to help, but my legs wouldn't move. After what felt like hours, the screams stopped, and the woods fell silent. I don't know how I made it back to my truck. The next thing I remember is sitting in the driver's seat, my hands trembling as I tried to start the engine. I didn't stop driving until I reached San Francisco, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. I haven't told anyone about what happened that night. Who would believe me? But if you ever find yourself at a rest area late at night and you see someone in the shadows, do yourself a favor. Get back in your truck and keep driving. Some things are better left alone. I've been a long-haul trucker in Europe for a decade now, and I've driven through almost every country on the continent. But there's one trip that still haunts me, and it happened just last month while driving through Romania. I was transporting a load from Budapest to Bucharest, a route that took me through the Carpathian Mountains. The scenery was breathtaking during the day, but as night fell, the roads became winding, dark, and eerily quiet. It was around midnight, and the fog was rolling in thick, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I was about halfway through my journey when I decided to take a break at a small, remote rest stop. There was an old wooden sign written in Romanian that I couldn't fully translate, but I gathered it was some sort of warning or advisory about the area. The rest stop was desolate, with just a couple of dim streetlights barely piercing through the fog. As I was stretching my legs and having a smoke, I noticed a figure standing near the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the lights. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the fog, but as I squinted, I realized it was a person, an old man, dressed in what looked like traditional Romanian peasant clothing. He didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I called out to him in English, asking if he needed help. He didn't respond. I tried again in the few words of Romanian I knew, but still nothing. I started to feel uneasy, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. There was something deeply unsettling about him. Then, out of nowhere, he raised his arm and pointed towards the forest. I glanced in the direction he was pointing, but all I could see were trees and darkness. When I looked back, the old man was gone, just vanished into the fog. Feeling spooked, I decided it was time to get back on the road. As I was climbing back into my truck, I heard a rustling noise behind me. I turned around and my heart nearly stopped. There were more of them, figures, shadowy and indistinct, emerging from the forest and moving slowly towards the rest stop. I jumped into the cab, locked the doors, and started the engine. My headlights barely cut through the fog, but I could see the figures getting closer. Their faces were pale and gaunt, eyes hollow and lifeless. I floored the accelerator as I sped out of the rest stop and back onto the road. For the next few hours, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of a figure in my rearview mirror, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. The fog clung to the mountains, making the drive even more harrowing. When I finally reached Bucharest, I was exhausted and shaken. I told my contact there about what I'd seen, expecting him to laugh it off or tell me I was just tired. Instead, his face grew serious, and he told me about the local legends. Stories of restless spirits in the Carpathians, souls of those who had died in the mountains and couldn't find peace. I don't know if what I saw were ghosts or just figments of my imagination, but I haven't driven that route since. And if you ever find yourself on those winding mountain roads at night, beware of the fog and the shadows it hides. Some things are better left unseen. I've been trucking for 5 years now, ever since I dropped out of college. It wasn't what I envisioned for my life, but here I am, living out of my rig, driving endless miles with nothing but the hum of the engine and the occasional radio chatter to keep me company. Sometimes I wonder how it all went so wrong, how I ended up here, exhausted and alone. Last week I had a run from Chicago to Dallas. I was already behind schedule, pushing myself to make up lost time. I just wanted to get it over with, drop the load and find a cheap motel where I could crash for a few hours. It was around midnight and I was driving through a desolate stretch of highway in Missouri. My eyelids felt heavy and I knew I needed to stop before I fell asleep at the wheel. I pulled into a small truck stop that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 70s. The neon sign flickered and there were only a couple of other trucks parked there. I parked my rig, grabbed my thermos, and headed inside. The diner was dingy, the kind of place where the smell of grease and stale coffee lingered in the air. A tired-looking waitress gave me a nod as I sat at the counter and ordered a burger and a coffee. As I waited for my food, I noticed a man sitting at a booth in the back, staring at me. He was probably in his late 40s, with a scruffy beard and a worn-out baseball cap. There was something off about the way he was looking at me, but I was too tired to care. I just wanted to eat and get some sleep. When my food arrived, I ate quickly, hoping to get back to my truck and catch a few hours of rest. As I was finishing up, the man from the booth walked over and sat down next to me. He reeked of alcohol and sweat. "Hey there, buddy," he slurred. "You headed south?" I didn't want to be rude, but I also didn't want to engage. "Yeah, just passing through," I replied, trying to keep my answer short. "You know, I could use a ride. My car broke down a few miles back and I need to get to the next town," he said, leaning in closer. Something about his demeanor set off alarm bells in my head. "Sorry, man, I can't help you. Company policy," I lied. His expression changed from friendly to menacing in an instant. "Come on, don't be like that. I just need a ride." I stood up, leaving some cash on the counter. "I gotta go. Good luck with your car." As I walked out, I could feel his eyes burning into my back. I quickened my pace, anxious to get back to the safety of my truck. Just as I reached my rig, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw the man, now joined by 2 others who looked equally rough. All I asked for was a ride. "Why'd you have to be so rude about it?" I heard. I could almost smell the alcohol from the way he spoke. It sounded like he had gotten twice as intoxicated in the short 30 seconds since he had last spoken. "We need to be in Lafayette by the morning, please. Just give us a chance." I don't know who these guys thought they were or how stupid they thought I was, but there was no chance in hell they were getting in my truck. I felt myself begin to panic a bit. I scanned the lot, but it was empty. It was the middle of the night. The waitress from the diner certainly wasn't coming. If these guys tried something, there would be no one around to help. My heart started racing as I weighed my options. I was a big guy, but even I knew I couldn't take on 3 guys by myself. I kept a big Bowie knife behind my seat. It was more with me as a souvenir and very dull, but they wouldn't know that. I opened the door of my truck, pretending to comply. "All right, I gotta move some stuff around before I can fit the 3 of you." As I reached inside, I grabbed the blade and swung it at the man closest to me, catching him off guard. He stumbled back, cursing. The other 2 tried to grab at me, but I managed to be vigorous enough to break free and swing again, slashing one of them in the arm. I shouted a jumble of swear words and threats at the top of my lungs like a lunatic. They were taken aback. It was pure adrenaline, borderline blackout. The men hesitated, sizing me up. I could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They weren't expecting a fight. Certainly not one where their victim held a blade. Plus, they were hammered. "We'll find you, pussy," one of them muttered. They backed off, maybe 15 feet away, and then just stood watching me. I jumped into my truck, locked the doors, and floored it out of there. My hands were shaking from the adrenaline, and my heart was still pounding, but I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I've had my share of bad nights on the road, but this one took the cake. As I drove towards Dallas, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of melancholy. This wasn't the life I wanted. This felt like the last straw, but I was in the thick of it now. I had to see it through. Stay safe out there, folks, and for the love of God, trust your instincts. I know some friends with no survival reflex. They would never have even recognized the danger until it was too late. If something feels off, it probably is. I've been doing long-haul trucking for about 6 years now, and let me tell you, the road is not always as straightforward as it seems. You get your fair share of odd encounters, but there's one that still sticks with me, and it's not because of anything supernatural. This one was all too real. It was early last fall, and I was hauling a load from Pittsburgh to Denver. The route took me through some pretty isolated parts of the Midwest. It was one of those stretches where you can go hours without seeing another car, let alone a town. I was feeling particularly worn out from the constant driving and lack of sleep, and my mood was about as bleak as the landscape around me. I had just crossed into Nebraska when I decided I needed a break. I found a tiny rest stop off the highway, barely more than a patch of gravel and an old gas pump. There was a small convenience store that looked like it saw a maximum of 2 customers daily, but it had lights on, so I figured it was good enough for a quick stop. Inside, the place was empty except for the cashier, an older guy who gave me a nod as I walked in. I grabbed a coffee and some snacks, and as I was paying, I noticed a bulletin board by the door. It was covered with the usual community notices, missing pets and help-wanted ads, but one flyer caught my eye. It was a simple piece of paper with a photo of a young woman and the words "missing" in bold letters. The date on the flyer was recent. "People go missing around here often?" I asked the cashier, trying to make small talk. He looked up, his expression grim. "More than you'd think. Lot of open space out here, easy to get lost or worse." I nodded, feeling a bit uneasy. I took my coffee and headed back to my truck. As I was getting ready to leave, I noticed an old, beat-up van parked a few spaces away. It wasn't there when I arrived. A man was sitting in the driver's seat watching me. He had a scruffy beard and wore a dirty baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Something about him made my skin crawl, but I shrugged it off. People live in all kinds of vehicles out here, right? I got back on the highway, but the image of that missing woman and the creepy guy in the van stuck with me. About an hour down the road, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. The same beat-up van was tailing me, keeping a steady distance. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but after another half hour of the van shadowing my every move, I knew something was up. I tried to shake him by taking an exit and looping back onto the highway, but the van followed. My heart rate started to pick up, and I was running through all the scenarios in my head. Why was this guy following me? Did he think I was someone else, or was it something more sinister? I decided to pull into a larger truck stop up ahead, one with plenty of lights and other people around. I figured if I could get around other drivers, maybe the guy would back off. I parked my rig and went inside, pretending to browse while keeping an eye on the door. Sure enough, the guy from the van walked in a few minutes later. He didn't buy anything, just stood by the entrance, watching me. I walked over to a couple of truckers who were sitting at a table and struck up a conversation, explaining the situation. They were skeptical at first, but when I pointed out the guy, they agreed to help. We all walked out together, and the man in the van quickly got back inside and drove off. I thought that would be the end of it, but as I settled back into my truck, I noticed something strange. There was a piece of paper stuck under my windshield wiper. I got out and grabbed it, my hands trembling. It was a handwritten note, "Mind your own business." That was it for me. I called the local sheriff's office and reported everything: the missing woman, the creepy guy, the note. They took my statement and promised to look into it, but I never heard back. For the rest of my trip, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every set of headlights in my mirror made my heart race. I made it to Denver without further incident, but the whole experience left me rattled. I've since learned to be more cautious and always trust my gut. If something feels off, it probably is. And if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, don't hesitate to reach out for help. There's no shame in being careful. Sometimes it can make all the difference. Stay safe out there, fellow drivers. The road is long and lonely, but we've got to look out for each other. If you have any scary stories you'd like to see featured on this channel, feel free to email horrormalevolent@gmail.com. Thank you for watching, and make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed.